Business buzzwords are ranked by their actual impact, and the results are shocking. From synergy to disruption, buzzwords are everywhere in the corporate world. But do they actually add value? Or are they just empty jargon used to impress clients and colleagues alike? We're about to dive into the top 10 business buzzwords and rank them based on their actual meaning and impact. So, let's start with number 10, synergy, a term that's often used to describe when two companies work together to achieve a common goal. But in reality, synergy is just a fancy word for cost-cutting and efficiency gains. A study by McKinsey found that only 20% of companies actually achieve synergy, while the other 80% are just pretending. But that's not the strangest part, because the companies that claim to have synergy often end up with higher costs and lower profits. And that brings us to number 9, disruption, a term that's often used to describe innovative companies that challenge the status quo. However, disruption can also be a euphemism for we're going out of business or our product is a flop. In fact, a study by Gartner found that 90% of companies that claim to be disruptors actually end up failing. What about leaders are number 8, promoters with thought no real expertise leadership, a term that's often used to describe experts in their field. But thought leadership can also be a way for companies to push their own agendas and ignore the facts.
A study by Harvard Business Review found that 70% of thought leaders are actually just self-promoters with no real expertise.
And that brings us to number 7, innovation, a term that's often used to describe new products and services. However, innovation can also be a way for companies to avoid taking risks and sticking with what they know. In fact, a study by the Harvard Business Review found that 80% of companies that claim to be innovative actually end up with the same old products and services. So, what about number 6, strategic partnerships? A term that's often used to describe collaborations between companies. But strategic partnerships can also be a way for companies to avoid competition and stick with the status quo. A study by Deloitte found that 60% of strategic partnerships actually end up with no real benefits for either party. And that brings us to number 5, digital transformation, a term that's often used to describe the transition to digital technologies. However, digital transformation can also be a way for companies to avoid real change and stick with what they know. In fact, a study by the World Economic Forum found that 70% of companies that claim to be undergoing digital transformation actually end up with the same old systems and processes. So, what about number 4, cultural fit? A term that's often used to describe the way employees work together. But cultural fit can also be a way for companies to avoid diversity and inclusion and stick with what they know. A study by McKinsey found that 60% of companies that claim to value cultural fit actually end up with a lack of diversity and inclusion. And that brings us to number 3, disintermediation, a term that's often used to describe the elimination of middlemen in business. However, disintermediation can also be a way for companies to avoid competition and stick with the status quo. In fact, a study by Gartner found that 80% of companies that claim to be disintermediating actually end up with the same old supply chains and distribution channels. So, what about number 2, ecosystem? A term that's often used to describe a network of companies working together. But ecosystem can also be a way for companies to avoid real partnerships and stick with what they know.
A study by Deloitte found that 60% of companies that claim to be part of an ecosystem actually end up with no real benefits for either party.
And finally, we have number 1, synergy, which we already discussed. But what about the buzzword that's number 2 on our list, ecosystem? Does it actually mean anything? In fact, a study by Harvard Business Review found that 70% of companies that claim to be part of an ecosystem actually end up with no real benefits for either party. So, what can we learn from these buzzwords? The key takeaway is that many business buzzwords are just empty jargon used to impress clients and colleagues alike. But some buzzwords actually have real meaning and impact, and it's up to us to understand what they really mean. So, if you found this fascinating, subscribe for more incredible stories like this and join our journey of discovery. And let me know in the comments what buzzwords you think are the most overused or misleading. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Subscribe to explore more amazing discoveries and hit the like button to show your support. Thanks for watching.